Clara never thought she would begin anything new at 70. Life, by then, had settled into a quiet rhythm, morning tea steeped slowly by the kitchen window, afternoon hours spent tending to a few tired potted plants, and evenings curled up in a worn armchair, listening to the same radio her husband once fixed decades ago. Nothing much changed, and no one really waited for her anymore. She used to tell herself that was okay. Enough. But then, one early March morning, sunlight slipped through the kitchen blinds and touched the corner of an old drawer she hadn't opened in years. Inside, nestled between faded receipts and forgotten photos, lay a small packet of flower seeds. The envelope had yellowed with time, the handwriting barely legible. "White daisies, your favorite." And below that, a second line, scribbled in a hand she knew better than her own. Paul, her husband, gone now for nearly 12 years. That little packet did something to her. Stirred something. A memory, maybe. Or a feeling that had been sleeping for far too long. Clara couldn't explain it, but suddenly, she had to plant them. Not for the flowers. Not for the garden. But because something deep inside her wanted to bloom again. She didn't know, not then, that those first handfuls of soil would lead to more than petals and stems. That within weeks, her garden would bring laughter, conversations, and a friendship she never knew she needed. Clara had lived in the same house for 47 years. The curtains had changed, the furniture had aged, and new cracks had quietly made their way across the ceiling, like silent veins of time, but the bones of the home remained. It stood still and steady, just like she had. And yet, even in its familiarity, the house had grown a little colder in recent years. After Paul passed, the kitchen felt wider. The bedroom felt too quiet. And the hallway, where once two sets of slippers used to meet at the middle, now echoed with just hers, soft and solitary. Her days followed a rhythm that no longer surprised her. Wake at 7. Boil the kettle. Choose between chamomile or early gray, depending on the sky. Sit by the kitchen window and watch the world go on without her. There was a peace in it, but not joy. Clara had grown used to her solitude, not by choice, but by slow erosion. Her daughter lived 3 hours away, teaching piano to high school students. Her son had taken a job overseas 10 years ago, and though he called every few weeks, his voice always felt like it came from another world entirely. They weren't unkind, just distant. Time had pulled at their closeness like tides, and Clara, unwilling to cling or guilt or burden, had let it. Sometimes she wondered if her children remembered the woman she once was, the girl who read books under the apple tree at 16, who wore yellow skirts in spring, who kissed their father in the rain just to feel something cinematic. That woman had faded into photos now, tucked away in albums no one opened anymore. Afternoons were the hardest. There was something about 3 o'clock, the way the sun sat in the sky, lazy and golden, the way the silence pressed a little heavier into the wallpaper, that made her feel like a forgotten note in a song no longer played. On most days, Clara would take her tea out to the small wooden steps at the back of the house. The garden, if one could still call it that, was more earth than life. What used to be Paul's pride and joy had become a tangle of weeds and stubborn grasses. The roses he once pruned had wilted long ago. The tiny stone path he'd laid with their grandson on a long ago summer afternoon had been swallowed up by moss. She looked at it all not with shame, but with resignation. "I'm too old to kneel in the dirt," she'd whisper aloud, as if someone were listening. But no one ever was. And yet, every time she sat on those steps, her eyes would drift to the corner patch of soil, right beneath the kitchen window, where daisies used to grow. Paul had planted them there the year after they moved in. "Something simple for you," he'd said, brushing her hair behind her ear, "and stubborn like me." They'd bloomed every summer since. Until they didn't. It had been 4 summers now. Clara could still picture them, those white petals catching the breeze, swaying like they were dancing just for her. She missed them, not just for their beauty, but for what they reminded her of. The man who used to hum while he watered them, the feeling of home being shared. Her last birthday, she didn't tell anyone. 70 felt like too big a number to say aloud. She let the day pass with just a cup of peach tea and a silent toast to herself. A neighbor had left a card in the mailbox and signed but thoughtful. Inside, the words, "You make the world softer just by being in it." Clara kept it on the fridge, pinned with a ceramic magnet shaped like a pear. She hadn't felt soft in a long time. She had felt dried out, like parchment, brittle and holding stories no one read. Until that morning. The morning she found the seed packet. It was almost accidental. She was looking for old baking pans, thinking perhaps she'd finally attempt the peach cobbler recipe she clipped from the newspaper 3 years ago. Her fingers brushed the packet as she reached into the drawer, and something in her paused. It was light, almost weightless, but it held gravity. She turned it over slowly, and the sight of Paul's handwriting, faint, tilted, utterly his, hit her like a sudden gust of spring wind through a closed room. Her breath caught, not from sadness, from something quieter. Recognition, maybe. Or the strange way time collapses when a memory returns too vividly. She sat at the kitchen table and stared at the packet for almost 20 minutes. Didn't even make her tea. Her thumb traced the words like a fingertip brushing a face long gone. "White daisies, your favorite." He remembered. Of course he had. But the reminder now felt like a whisper from another lifetime. That evening, she didn't go out to the steps. She stood by the sink, the packet still in her hand, and looked out at the yard. The soil didn't look inviting. It looked like it had given up. But Clara had this thought, quiet and fleeting, that perhaps it was waiting. Maybe they were both waiting. That night, she placed the seed packet gently on her nightstand. Next to her reading glasses, her bookmark, and the photo of Paul with the grandkids. She turned off the light, lay in bed, and whispered to the darkness, "Maybe we'll try." Sleep came slowly, not from exhaustion but from calm. It wrapped around her like soft linen sheets dried in the sun. The next morning, she rose before the kettle sang, before the birds found their song, before the newspaper hit the porch. And for the first time in years, she stepped outside not just to watch, but to begin. Clara wasn't sure what she was doing, but her hands moved with a kind of quiet certainty. The garden gloves she found in the shed were worn, one finger torn, the fabric stiff with age. She slipped them on anyway. The sun had barely lifted above the rooftops, casting long golden strokes across the backyard. The soil was still damp with the breath of morning. She knelt carefully, her knees protesting, but not too loudly. It had been years since she'd asked her body to do something that required both effort and intention. And yet here she was, sleeves rolled, fingers in the dirt, not because someone told her to, but because something inside her whispered, "Begin here." The first trowel of earth felt like a memory. The scent of soil rose up to meet her, rich and full of something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't just dirt. It was life that had waited in silence, time that had been buried. She cleared a small patch under the kitchen window, the very spot where Paul's daisies used to bloom. The weeds gave way with surprising ease, like they, too, were ready for change. The roots that clung stubbornly to the earth snapped gently, falling aside like old conversations that no longer needed to be held onto. She worked slowly, stopping often, not from exhaustion but from reverence. Each motion felt sacred. Each handful of soil felt like a note in a song she used to hum, but had forgotten the lyrics to. When she finally opened the seed packet, she held her breath. They were tiny, almost invisible, nestled within the yellowing paper like fragile promises. She poured them into her palm, and for a long moment, just looked at them. So small, she thought, so easily ignored. And yet, they held everything. With trembling fingers, she scattered them into the earth. Not with precision, not with fear, just gently, like returning something to its home. She covered them lightly, pressed her hand over the soil, and whispered something she didn't plan to say. "Grow well, my love." She didn't cry. Not then. The tears would come later. For now, she stood and brushed the dirt from her knees, surprised at how alive her arms felt, how present her breath had become. Clara watered them that morning, and again in the evening, and then again the next day. She wasn't sure how often she was supposed to, the packet didn't say, but it felt right to tend to them gently, as one tends to a flickering hope. Each morning became something to look forward to. She'd wake just before sunrise, slip her feet into her house shoes, and shuffle to the back porch with a cup of tea. The kettle knew its new rhythm. So did the wind chimes. On the third morning, she noticed a tiny green curve breaking through the soil, one brave shoot stretching toward the light. Her heart lifted in a way that startled her. It was just a sprout, a slip of green no taller than her pinky nail. And yet, it was becoming. She smiled, truly smiled, in a way she hadn't in years. From that day on, the garden became her companion. She began to speak to it. Not in full conversations, not yet, but in murmurs and phrases. "There you are. Bit more sun today, hum? You're not in a hurry, I see." She didn't feel foolish. The garden didn't mind her silences, didn't rush her thoughts. It just listened, blooming in its own time, forgiving in a way people rarely are. And as the days unfolded, so did Clara. She started wearing her old straw hat again, the one Paul used to tease her about. "My little gardener," he'd call her. It still fit. She began humming under her breath, rediscovering the melodies that had once lived in her hands. Neighbors began to notice. One morning, a woman walking her dog slowed down near the fence. She smiled and called out, "That's quite the little patch you've got growing." Clara waved shyly. "Trying to remember how it's done," she replied. "Well, you're doing something right," the woman said. "It's lovely. Lovely." The words stayed with Clara all day. She hadn't been called lovely in a long time. Not her, not anything she'd touched. Over the next few weeks, the garden expanded. Not because she planned it, but because something in her had awakened. A quiet desire to see color where there had been none. She planted lavender next, remembering the scent of Paul's old aftershave. Then marigolds, because her daughter once made her a pressed flower card with them in 3rd grade. Then mint, because her grandson liked it in his lemonade. It was strange how the act of planting could summon the past in such gentle ways. Clara didn't feel haunted. She felt held, as though each bloom was a voice she hadn't heard in years saying, "You're still here. And you still matter." And she did matter. Not because of what she could give, or say, or prove, but simply because she was present, watering, tending, watching over something that would outlast her. Sometimes, as she knelt in the dirt, she thought of the younger Clara, the one who had dreams of traveling to the French countryside, the one who used to write poetry on napkins, who danced barefoot in the kitchen while soup simmered. That Clara hadn't disappeared. She had just gone quiet. And now, with every bud, with every stem daring to push through the dark, Clara felt her voice returning, softly, in petals, in leaves. She began journaling again, only a few lines each day, written in the margins of a recipe book no one used anymore. She didn't call it poetry, but it was. She wrote, "Somewhere between soil and sky, I found a piece of myself I thought I buried with him. The garden doesn't ask who you were, only who you are today." And her favorite, "Every bloom is a yes I was too afraid to say out loud." It was a Tuesday morning when Clara first noticed the figure by the fence. At first, she assumed it was someone passing through, a walker, perhaps, or another neighbor she hadn't met. She didn't wave, didn't speak. She was crouched over the lavender bed, gently removing a weed that dared to grow too close to her memory of Paul's favorite scent. But when she stood up, brushing the soil from her knees, the figure was still there, not quite at the gate, not quite leaving. She squinted, sunlight playing tricks with her eyes. A woman, maybe younger, maybe not. Somewhere in that soft middle ground where age sits without explanation. Shoulder-length gray hair tucked behind her ears, a canvas bag slung over one arm. She wore no makeup, just a gentle face, like a page that had been folded and unfolded too many times but never torn. Their eyes met. Neither looked away. Then the woman smiled, not wide, not bold, but the kind of smile that says, "I see you." The kind Clara had once given and received during long, silent church pews. Wordless, but whole. Clara hesitated, unsure if she should speak first. "Beautiful daisies," the woman finally said. Her voice was warm, slightly husky, the kind of voice that might read poetry in libraries or whisper secrets to sleeping cats. Clara blinked, then nodded. "First ones in years." They look happy, the woman said. Like they've been waiting. Clara surprised herself with a soft laugh. So have I. There was a pause. The woman didn't move. I walk by here most mornings, she said. Always liked your yard, even before the flowers. Clara tilted her head. Really? Before it looked like a jungle. The woman grinned. It looked lived in. That's rare these days. Clara felt something shift in her chest. It wasn't quite a tear, and it wasn't quite joy. Just a quiet rearranging, like furniture being moved in a long-abandoned room. I'm Clara, she said. June, the woman replied. They stood there for a moment longer, two women on either side of a wooden fence softened by time and ivy. The kind of fence that kept pets in but never really kept people out. June glanced at the daisies again. You're doing something lovely here. Clara looked down at the soil, the specks of dirt still clinging to her palms, the green leaves trembling gently in the breeze. She nodded. I didn't think it would matter this much, she said. Planting things. June didn't answer right away. Then she said, it always matters when we decide to begin again. There was a silence after that, not heavy, but full. I should let you get back to it, June finally said, adjusting the strap of her bag. You can come by any time. Clara found herself saying, quickly, as if the words might escape if she didn't say them now. The garden doesn't mind company. June smiled again, wider this time. Maybe I will. And just like that, she was gone, walking down the narrow path that curved behind the hedges, leaving behind a faint trace of sandalwood and soft footsteps. Clara stood at the gate long after she left, wondering at the feeling blooming inside her. It wasn't just the flowers. It wasn't just the sun. It was the sudden, unexpected thrill of being seen, not as an old woman with a watering can, but as a whole person, still unfolding. That afternoon, Clara made a second cup of tea, not because she needed it, but because the act of steeping it, the warmth, the waiting, the soft aroma felt like preparing for something. She placed 2 cups on the table out back, just in case. The next morning, June returned. She didn't knock. She didn't announce herself. She simply appeared at the gate, holding a book in one hand and a paper bag in the other. I brought blueberry scones, she said, lifting the bag. Still warm. Clara opened the gate without hesitation. They sat in the shade, sipping tea, breaking scones into small bites. The conversation was easy, not rushed. They spoke of gardens and how lavender hated too much shade, of old recipes, and how hard it was to find good peaches anymore. June mentioned she used to teach literature. Clara confessed she used to write poems but stopped after Paul died. I haven't said that out loud in years, Clara murmured, fingers wrapped around her cup. You should say it more, June replied. And they did. Not all at once, not in great confessions, but over days that stretched into weeks, over morning teas and small afternoon walks around the garden beds. They said things that had waited too long to be spoken. June became part of the garden. Not like a guest, but like a perennial, something that belonged there, quietly and naturally. She brought cuttings from her own backyard, little pots of forget-me-nots and creeping thyme. Together, they made space for them in the soil, laughing as they bent low, knees cracking, hands dirty, hearts lighter than they'd felt in years. Sometimes they spoke of their pasts. Sometimes they didn't. There was a day when June arrived without a smile, eyes red, voice small. Today would have been my sister's 75th, she said, sitting heavily on the garden bench. Clara didn't ask questions. She simply placed a hand over June's and said, "We'll plant something for her." They chose marigolds, bright, bold, and impossible to ignore. And when the first bloom opened weeks later, June whispered, she would have liked this. The garden held it all. The grief, the laughter, the growing. It became a place where memory and possibility sat side by side, rooted in the same soil. And Clara, who once thought her days of making new friends were over, now found herself looking forward to each sunrise, not just for the flowers, but for the footprints that would soon appear on the path. Friendship had returned to her not with grand gestures, but with scones and soil, with silence and seeds, with 2 women standing on either side of a wooden fence, choosing quietly, courageously, to let someone in. The garden was no longer Clara's alone. She didn't recall the exact moment it happened, when her private patch of soil and silence became a place for two. There had been no formal invitation, no spoken agreement, only the slow, steady rhythm of shared mornings and mutual presence. And somehow, between tea and time and conversations that unfolded like petals, the garden had grown larger, not in size, but in meaning. Now, June would arrive most mornings around 9. Not always with baked goods, not always with stories, but always with a presence that felt like sunlight after days of rain. Sometimes, they gardened side by side, kneeling in the earth, pulling weeds, spacing out seedlings with the kind of care that came from years of tending to children and husbands and aching bodies. Other days, they simply sat, two women, mugs in hand, watching the wind nudge the lavender, or the bees hum through the daisies. They didn't need to speak to feel connected. The silence between them had softened, like soil loosened after the rain, fertile and full of possibility. June began bringing little treasures from her home. A faded wind chime that tinkled like laughter, a chipped ceramic frog her niece once painted, a pair of wrought iron chairs that had sat and used on her back patio for years. She never asked permission. She simply arrived with them, gently placing each item in its chosen spot, as if the garden had requested it herself. And Clara, for the first time in a very long time, did not feel the need to control or cure it. She welcomed the additions the way she welcomed June, with quiet gratitude. There was something about growing things together that made it easier to grow trust. Clara found herself opening in ways she hadn't expected. She told June about the year she lost the baby, the one she never named. About the time she and Paul almost sold the house and moved to the coast, but backed out at the last minute because he couldn't leave the pear tree in the backyard. June, in turn, shared about her sister, the brilliant one who died too young, and about the summer her marriage ended with a note left on the kitchen table and 2 empty coffee mugs. She didn't cry when she told it. She just looked at the marigolds, blooming bold and unafraid, and said, "He never liked color anyway." In each other, they found what they hadn't known they were missing. Not just company, but reflection. A mirror held up gently, saying, "You're still here. You're still growing." As weeks passed, the garden transformed. Not just in its appearance, though that too. The once forgotten plot now bloomed in hues of white and violet, yellow and coral, the air alive with scent, and the slow dance of bees and butterflies. But the true change was quieter. Clara's gait, though still slow, now carried a lightness. Her shoulders, once slightly slumped from years of solitude, had begun to lift. Her laugh returned, not as a memory, but as a rhythm. She began to wear lipstick again, a soft rose tint she found at the back of her drawer, still usable after all these years. And June, who had once passed by with guarded steps, now moved through the garden like someone at home. She'd hum absent-mindedly while trimming herbs, or recite snippets of poetry while deadheading roses. One day, Clara came out to find a tiny sign staked in the soil near the mid-bed. It was made of wood, carefully painted, with 2 simple words. "Still blooming." Clara touched it with her fingertips, the paint still fresh. "I love it," she said softly. June smiled, not looking up from her work. "I figured it was true." They began a new ritual after that. Every Friday morning, they'd sit beneath the old maple tree at the corner of the yard with a small notepad between them. On it, they'd take turns writing something the garden had taught them that week. They called it their Friday reflections, though neither insisted on the name. Some entries were simple. "Patience brings beauty. Everything leans toward light. Don't pull a weed until you're sure it's not something trying to grow." Others went deeper. "Being quiet doesn't mean being forgotten. Grief doesn't kill you. It just asks you to love again, differently. Even after a frost, something always returns." They kept the pages in a folder Clara once used for old tax receipts. It was a small rebellion, trading spreadsheets for soul work. The garden became more than a sanctuary. It became a testament to late beginnings, to female friendship, to healing that arrives not with fanfare but with the steady bloom of daisies at dawn. Neighbors began to take notice. People walking dogs or strolling with morning coffee would pause longer at the gate. A few asked about the types of flowers. Some just smiled and nodded, perhaps sensing that something sacred was happening there, Not loud, not dramatic, but real. One afternoon, a teenage girl from 2 doors down slipped a note through the fence. It read, "Your garden makes me feel less lonely. Thank you." Clara placed it on the fridge with the same pear-shaped magnet that once held her birthday card. June cried when she read it. The garden didn't just belong to Clara and June anymore. It belonged to everyone who needed proof that beauty was still possible, that roots could take hold at any age, and that blooming wasn't reserved for the young. But most of all, it belonged to the friendship that had grown in its center, a bond not forged by time or obligation, but by presence, by tea shared on quiet mornings, by the unspoken agreement to show up, again and again, without needing to be asked. Clara often thought about how it all began, one packet of forgotten seeds, tucked away like a secret note from the past. She sometimes wondered if Paul had meant for her to find them, or if, in some quiet twist of grace, life had known exactly when to place that memory in her hands. She didn't believe in signs, not exactly, but she believed in gardens. She believed in mornings that start over. She believed in the way 2 hands in the dirt could begin to stitch something back together, not the past, not what was lost, but the heart that had carried it all. Clara wasn't one for birthdays. Not anymore. Not since the cake had stopped coming with candles. Not since the calls from her children grew shorter, more efficient, sandwiched between meetings and school drop-offs. Not since Paul's absence had turned celebrations into something quieter. Something folded. Last year, on her 70th, she had celebrated alone. A cup of peach tea. A walk around the block. A whispered happy birthday to herself in the hallway mirror before bed. She hadn't told anyone. Not out of bitterness, just habit. It had felt easier to let the day pass like any other. But this year was different. It started with a note tucked beneath her front doormat. Handwritten, ink slightly smudged. In June's unmistakable cursive. "Don't make plans for tomorrow morning. Wear something floral. Bring your favorite mug. J." Clara smiled when she found it. She folded the paper neatly and placed it in the small dish, where she kept loose buttons and stray safety pins. Something fluttered inside her anticipation, the shy kind she hadn't felt since her 20s. It felt foolish. And lovely. She didn't sleep much that night. Not because she was anxious, but because her mind kept drifting to memories, to flowers, to that single phrase, "Bring your favorite mug." The next morning, July sunlight spilled across her kitchen floor, soft and golden like butter melting across warm bread. She dressed slowly, choosing a blue cotton dress printed with faded daisies, one she hadn't worn in years. She brushed her hair, added a touch of rose-pink lipstick, and placed a spritz of perfume behind her ears. The same scent Paul used to compliment when they'd go dancing, back when dancing had felt endless. Then, with her favorite mug in hand, the chipped ceramic one painted by her grandson when he was 6, the one that read "World's Best Grandma," even when she's grumpy, she stepped outside and gasped. The garden had transformed overnight. Color was everywhere. Ribbons of soft cloth tied to the tree branches, fluttering in the breeze. Bouquets of wildflowers arranged in empty jam jars along the stone path. A folded table set beneath the maple tree, adorned with mismatched teacups, scones, small pies, and a single birthday candle flickering bravely in the morning light. And standing in the center of it all, holding a watering can shaped like a cat and grinning ear to ear, was June. "Happy 71st, Clara." Clara stood frozen for a moment, her hand clutching her mug, eyes shimmering with disbelief. "You did all this?" she whispered. June tilted her head. "Well, the garden helped. But yes." Clara stepped forward slowly, her feet moving as if toward something sacred, as if she might wake from it if she moved too fast. "I haven't had a birthday like this since," her voice faltered. June reached out and took her hand. "Then let's make it one to remember." The morning unfolded like a song. Neighbors drifted in, not in droves, but gently, like petals on a breeze. The teenage girl from 2 doors down brought a lemon loaf she'd baked herself. Mr. Alvarez from across the street played his accordion softly near the fence. Even Mrs. Weaver, who rarely left her porch, came with a jar of plum jam wrapped in cloth. No one said surprise. No one shouted. There were no banners, no streamers, no loud declarations of age. Only warmth. Only presence. Only the quiet honoring of a life still blooming. They sipped tea and shared stories. June recited a short poem she had written on a napkin. Someone played an old French song on a Bluetooth speaker. Clara even danced, just a little, swaying gently in the grass with her eyes closed. The sun on her shoulders, the memory of Paul's hand at her back almost tangible. At one point, June handed Clara a small box, wrapped in tissue paper the color of spring sky. Inside was a necklace, simple silver, with a small pendant shaped like a daisy. On the back was engraved, "Still blooming." Clara blinked rapidly, but the tears came anyway, not from sadness, but from fullness. She looked at June, voice unsteady. "No one has ever seen me the way you do." June shook her head, smiling softly. "You were always there, Clara. You just needed someone to remind you." As the sun climbed higher, the garden glowed, not just from the flowers or the light, but from the unmistakable energy of belonging, of joy found late, but deeply, of a life no longer paused. At the end of the gathering, as guests slowly filtered out, leaving behind half-eaten cakes and muddy footprints and scattered petals, Clara sat back in her garden chair, eyes closed, heart wide open. June sat beside her in silence, the two women now worn but content, like pages well read and well loved. "You know," Clara said at last, "I didn't think I had anything left to celebrate." "And now?" June asked. Clara opened her eyes, gazing at the garden, the herbs, the colors, the ribbons still dancing in the trees. "Now I think I've only just begun." They sat a little longer after that, sipping what was now lukewarm tea from their favorite mugs, surrounded by the sound of bees, laughter and memory, and the tender truth that it's never too late, not for joy, not for friendship, not for blooming again. Autumn came softly, not all at once, but in hints, in the way the morning light thinned, paler and quieter than the bold gold of July, in how the daisies lingered a little longer, petals curling inward like hands gathering warmth, in the rustle of leaves that had grown tired of holding on. Clara noticed it first in the lavender. Its purple had faded, dulled to a smoky hue. The stems no longer stood upright but leaned, almost bowing to the earth that had carried them. She didn't feel sadness, just recognition. That time, even in its retreat, still carried beauty. The garden was slowing down, but not dying. No, it was preparing, resting, like a breath drawn inward before winter's hush. She adjusted her morning routine. No longer up at dawn, she waited now for the sun to rise just a bit higher, to warm the chill from the stones. Her tea came later. Her steps were slower. The garden asked less of her, not because it needed her less, but because it understood. June came less often now, though never absent. She had begun caring for her sister's grandchild twice a week, and had taken on a small poetry class at the community center. But each visit was as gentle and grounding as the first, always beginning with a smile and ending with silence shared under the maple. One morning, Clara stood alone in the yard, wrapped in a shawl that once belonged to her mother. A gentle breeze carried the scent of rosemary and drying soil. Her eyes traveled the garden path now speckled with leaves, uneven and golden, and she let out a breath that seemed to stretch into the sky. "This is the season," she whispered, "where everything lets go." She didn't mean just the garden. She had been letting go in small ways, not of the past, but of the grip it once held. The ache of what was lost had softened, not vanished. It would never vanish. But it no longer pressed against her chest with every step. It no longer stole the color from her days. She found herself thinking more, remembering differently. She thought of Paul not only as the man who left too soon, but as the one who had loved her enough to write her name on a seed packet. She remembered her children not for their distance, but for the echoes of their laughter once carved into the walls. She saw her younger self not as someone naive, but someone brave enough to try again and again, in marriage, in motherhood, in mourning. The garden had taught her this, that everything returns to the earth eventually, but not everything disappears. Some things take root. Some things bloom again, even when you don't expect them to. She began writing more in her reflection notebook, Sometimes full paragraphs, sometimes just single lines, like falling leaves. Aging is just autumn lived slowly. There is music in silence if you stay long enough. Nothing is finished, only paused. Even the barest branch remembers spring. One quiet Thursday, she stood at the edge of the garden and felt a deep, inexplicable stillness. The marigolds were gone. The daisies had surrendered. The only color left was the muted orange of the maple, its leaves holding on like memories, bright but brittle. Clara closed her eyes and felt it. Not grief. Gratitude. She had never known a season could feel like a friend. That evening, June arrived with a scarf around her neck and a thermos of hot cider. "It smells like cinnamon," Clara said, her hands warming around the mug. "It smells like closure," June replied. They sat in silence for a while, the sky darkening earlier now, the air more serious. "Do you ever wonder," Clara said quietly, "what would have happened if I hadn't found that seed packet?" June sipped. "I think you would have still bloomed. Just maybe somewhere else." Clara smiled. "I don't know. I was so quiet inside back then. Like something forgotten." June reached over and touched her hand. "And now?" Clara looked at her garden, no longer vibrant, but alive still in its own way. "Now I think I've remembered myself." It wasn't a declaration, just a truth. She had remembered how to open, how to laugh, how to reach out again without apology or fear. She had remembered how to live without waiting for permission. As the stars began to pierce the sky, June pulled something from her coat pocket. "I know it's a bit early," she said, "but I saw this at the shop and thought of you." It was a small tin, flower seeds. Spring bloomers. Inside, daffodils, cosmos, sweet peas. Clara turned the packet in her hand. Her eyes shimmered. "I never knew," she whispered, "how many second chances could grow from dirt." June smiled. "And you haven't even seen tulips yet." They laughed quietly. The sound rose above the sleeping flowers and into the cooling night, like a lullaby sung just for the earth. Later that evening, alone once more in her warm kitchen, Clara placed the new seed packet beside the one Paul had left all those years ago. Two beginnings. Two messages. One from the past. One for the future. She didn't cry. She didn't ache. She simply whispered to the seeds, "Rest now. We begin again soon." And somewhere beneath the soil, unseen but certain, the promise of spring began to stir. Winter didn't arrive all at once. It crept in softly, like a guest removing their shoes at the door. The garden fell silent, not in despair, but in rest. The earth grew still. The branches stood bare and unapologetic. Snow came only once light, like powdered sugar sifted over everything Clara had tended. She watched it from her kitchen window with hands wrapped around a mug of cocoa, her daisy pendant warm against her chest. She didn't mourn the silence. She honored it. For the first time in years, winter did not feel like an ending. It felt like a breath held between pages. Clara spent those cold months tending to other things, baking, sorting through old photos, writing poems she didn't call poems in the back of her recipe book. She and June still met, now indoors, their visits filled with slow stories and warm soups. Sometimes they didn't speak at all, just read in companionable quiet, the garden beyond the frosted glass patiently asleep. And then, one March morning, she stepped outside and felt it. The shift. It wasn't the temperature. It wasn't even the light. It was in the air, a softness, a subtle inhale. As if the ground itself had whispered, "I'm ready." Clara knelt at the garden's edge and touched the soil. Damp, yielding, alive again. That afternoon, she brought out the seed packets, the one Paul had left her, now empty but still sacred, and the one June had given her before the frost. She ran her fingers over the words "spring mix" and smiled. She didn't rush. She waited one more week, letting the sun warm the ground a little longer, letting the birds return, the breeze soften, the buds on the maple hint at green. And then, with June at her side, both women in wide-brimmed hats and old flannel shirts, she planted. Together, they tucked new life into the waiting earth. Cosmos, daffodils, sweet peas, and a few extra marigolds, just for good measure. Each seed went into the soil like a tiny offering not only to nature, but to time, to hope, to everything that had healed in them quietly over the past year. The days grew longer. The sun climbed higher. And then one morning, Clara looked out and saw it. The first bloom. A single daffodil, trembling in the breeze, its yellow face wide and open like a laugh that had been waiting too long. She called June. "Come quick." They stood in silence before it, 2 women and 1 small flower, and it was enough. More followed. The sweet peas climbed eagerly. The cosmos stretched tall and unbothered. Bees returned. Butterflies flirted with lavender that hadn't even bloomed yet. The garden came alive not in a rush, but in a quiet unfolding like a story told slowly with reverence. And Clara bloomed too. She laughed louder now, walked lighter, wrote more. She began sharing scones of her own with the neighbors, gave cuttings to the teenage girl next door who had started her own herb box, hung the small wooden sign on the garden gate that read, "Open to visitors, enjoy." On Clara's 72nd birthday, June surprised her with a cloth-bound journal titled The Garden Years. The first page was inscribed, "To the woman who thought she had nothing left to grow, and proved the whole world wrong." Clara cried that time, and June didn't look away. Later that summer, Clara was invited to speak at the local library's Late Bloomers Club, a gathering of women over 60 sharing stories of new beginnings. She was hesitant at first, unsure what she'd say. But June held her hand, and the garden had taught her. All she needed to do is begin. She told them everything. About the forgotten seed packet. About the lonely mornings and the first daisy that dared return. About June. About the way hands in soil could mend what no one could see. When she finished, the room was quiet. Then, slowly, the applause came warm, steady, like rain after drought. A woman approached her afterward, teary-eyed, and said, "I haven't planted anything in 20 years. I think I'll start this weekend." Clara smiled and said, "Start with something simple. Something honest. Daisies are good." That evening, back in her garden, she walked the stone path alone, her fingertips brushing leaves and petals as if greeting old friends. The sun melted into the horizon. Fireflies began to blink along the hedges. She stood beneath the maple tree, the one Paul once trimmed, the one she and June had tied ribbons to, the one under which so many cups of tea had been shared, and closed her eyes. The air smelled like mint and marigold. Laughter still lingered in the soil, and in her chest bloomed something even larger than gratitude. Peace. Not the kind that comes from stillness alone, but the kind that's earned, built, watered with tears and sunlight, with showing up, again and again, even when it's hard. Especially then. She had planted a garden at 70. And somewhere between the soil and the sky, between silence and the sound of a friend's voice, between a daisy and a memory, she had found herself again, in full bloom.